talk a little bit more about this. Let's break it down into the initial lead form compliance. When on your websites, and guys, I'll show you some numbers in a second, more than half of you probably on this call are not compliant with your opt-in. I actually just signed up our CTO for a webinar this morning with a very prestigious group, and their form for registration was not TCPA compliant. And it just blows my mind. So I'm just trying to educate you also you avoid some litigation issues that are bound to happen as the economy takes a slump, right? And so on your website, your opt-in has to be clearly visible, which means don't hide it. Don't make it 2-point font. Make it readable and legible and right. And you, generally speaking, my guidelines are between your form and your button. You need to have your opt-in statement. Don't bury it below the button where they could maybe have it cut off on a limited screen view. Make it between the form and your button. That's the best way to make sure it's clearly visible, and they have to see it before they submit. You have to use a compliant opt-in statement. This is where most of you are probably missing things, and this has changed, by the way. So if you felt like you were compliant 2 years ago, you probably were, now you're not. So inside of the form, you have to have a user permission statement, that by submitting I agree statement. You have to say these words: messaging rates may apply. That's not really an option for TCPA compliance. You also now have, they're asking you to talk about the frequency of messaging. So you're probably more of a blended message where it's primarily marketing, but it might become transactional. So just say messaging frequency may vary, period. That's all you got to say. But you have to address it. And then you also have to say reply stop to cancel at any time, and you need to reference your privacy policy. And if you are registering let's say you're a franchisor and you've got new franchisees registering new numbers, that registration process, they will deny your registration if you don't have a reference to your privacy policy. And sometimes they want you to have a link in that statement to your privacy policy so the consumer doesn't have to go find it. Bear in mind, that's a little squishy right now. We'll talk about that later, actually, the ghost organization doing texting auditing and compliance, but just make sure that you guys are following these rules and you'll be fine. And you also have to have best practices in place to manage opt-outs. So if somebody replies, if you have team members who are manually texting customers on your behalf as a business from their personal cell phones, be careful, because that's a business texting function and you are required to follow TCPA compliance. But if Bob, your 60-year-old sales guy, wants to text somebody after they said, hey, I'm not interested, stop. Well, he doesn't have an automatic opt-out process that's TCPA compliant. 2 months from now, he might text that person back. $1,500 is the fine if you violate TCPA per text. So if Bob goes off and starts texting 20 people, 30 people, you could rack up a pretty quick bill. There's also regulatory things happening around that. We'll talk about that later. Also, here's the thing where I see people make some mistakes. If you haven't talked to somebody, let's say you've got a franchise candidate who filled out a form 2 years ago. You messaged them and engaged with them for about 30 days. They went silent, and you haven't really talked to them for a while. They're in your dead lead list. 2 years later, you dust off Susan. And you're like, hey, Susan, I'm going to reach out to Susan. You start texting Susan again. She has no idea who you are. So even though she has opted in to talk to you before, it's been long enough that you're really in you're kind of out of the gray zone into the black zone of should you text her or not. In your first message, you need to treat it like it's a first contact, and you need to say, hey, Susan, you have to identify yourself, you have to identify your business, you have to also then give her an opt-out and tell her why you're texting her. So that first text needs to be a little more complicated than just a, hey, Susan, how you been? Kind of an outreach. But you also need to make sure you've got, you are giving them that opt-out message up front and identifying yourself properly as if it's a new contact. So you got to play by the same rules as if they were a brand new lead. If it's been over 18 months, typically that's kind of the guideline. Now, this is important stuff. This should be no surprise to you, but if a client replies wrong number, stop, cancel, F off, you really need to have some automation in place where you can stop the texting. And the only way that you can ever text them again is if they reply to you, start, resubscribe, uncancel, something that's a common phrase that somebody might use. Then the consumer is in control of the opt-in, opt-out process, and that is the whole crux of TCPA.